You just, all right, bitch. You pushing it. Come on now.
Don't need live action Moana. We don't need any more reboots. What is bothering me is that these companies are going back. They're not even going back to the drawing board. They're going back into like the cupboard of leftovers, regurgitating shit and giving it back to y'all, and y'all eat it up every time. Why the fuck Moana feels like it just happened? Why the fuck is Moana happening live action?
No, because it's getting out of hand now. What do you mean forced to be a teenager in 2025 meant to be a teenager in 2016?
When I was younger and I would show my mom a shirt or pants that I wanted, my mom always would say something like, oh, that's back in style. That was popular when I was in college. And she still does say that to this day. And for some reason, I never really believed her. It was kind of like there was no way the thing that I was into could have been popular when she was younger. I don't know. Young egos are crazy. But the older I get, the more it does feel kind of like deja vu. It feels like I've already seen everything before. And I know that's not actually possible, but a lot of what's popular right now are revivals. A lot of aesthetics like Y2K feel recent enough that I remember them the first time they were popular. And it's not only just fashion, it's also movies, music, art. Everything feels like a reboot, a recycle, wash, rinse, and repeat. And I'm definitely not one of those people that think everything was better back in my day. But if you look at popular culture right now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that was the case. This cycle of revival and recycling have been going on for years. And even now in 2025, there aren't many signs that it's going to slow down anytime soon. Culture really does feel like it's just eating itself. We keep on remixing and recycling and referencing so quickly that it's really hard to tell what's genuinely new or better yet fresh versus what's just another iteration of something that we've already seen and done before. And that brings me to the question that I really want to answer in this year-end video. Did culture peak? Are we past the point of real innovation and have we run out of new ideas? But before we get into it, I want to be clear about what I mean when I'm talking about culture in this video, because I'm not talking about all of culture. I'm mostly talking about creator culture, and that's not just influencer or social media posts, but the kind of culture that's shaped by visibility and metrics and platforms. It's specifically the culture that gets labeled and optimized and fed back to us through all of the algorithms that we're using. And that's whether it shows up on social media, in music, films, television, or online. There's definitely still plenty of culture that comes from actually living your life and from the different relationships that you build and from your communities, from local scenes, from people that are making things without having an audience in their mind. That kind of culture hasn't really disappeared, although that kind of culture also has been affected. So we'll discuss all of that. What's up, YouTube? I'm tinysey, and if you are returning, thank you so much for coming back. And if you're new, I hope that you enjoy it here. Feel free to look at all my other videos. I hope you guys all have a great holiday season. This is probably the last video of the year. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and welcome to my digital garden. While working on this video, I kept thinking about how often we talk past each other culturally and how a lot of that comes down to how information actually gets framed. The same story can be covered in totally different ways, and depending on which version you see, you can walk away with a completely different understanding. Most of us don't have the time or energy to read 15 articles just to figure out what's actually going on. So that's where Ground News has been really useful for me. Ground News is a website and app that pulls thousands of news articles into one place and organizes them by story. Each story shows the political lean of the outlets covering it, their reliability, and even who owns them. So you can see the full landscape without digging through dozens of tabs. Here's a story on social media used for kids. It's been covered by 15 outlets, and you can immediately see where they lean and how they frame it. One side calls it an urgent question, while another expresses skepticism and highlights how kids find ways around the ban. Same story, but different framing. I also really like the blind spot feed that shows stories one political side barely covers. It's a great way to understand what other people might not be seeing. Ground News genuinely helps me understand why people interpret the same event so differently. It makes the news feel less chaotic and more transparent for me. And if you subscribe through my link, you'll get 40% off their Vantage plan. You can go to ground.news/tinysey, use the link in the description or the QR code on the screen to subscribe today. Thank you to our sponsor, Ground News. On the fashion side of culture this year, the styles that felt most popular were all throwbacks. We had things like minimalism and quiet luxury that was giving Princess Diana in the 90s, or one of those old Ralph Lauren catalogs, and Y2K, which somehow is still the most popular style, but now it has more of a limited two twist. And within just a few years, we've cycled through 90s minimalism, Y2K, indie sleaze, and 2014 Tumblr. Not even full decades anymore. So we're kind of nostalgic for these very specific years or micro eras like 2016 Instagram makeup, which is really wild to me because I actually remember that era vividly. That's the year that I learned how to do my makeup. So it's weird that those types of things are already popping back up. We're mining the recent past so aggressively that we barely even let it become the past before we end up repackaging it as nostalgia. And I don't even get to someday tell my kids, oh, that was something that I was into in college, because it's already come back in style so fast. But I guess if this trend keeps going, yeah, something that I wear today will definitely be popular when they're like 5 years old. I'm also noticing the same nostalgia recycling thing happening in the music industry. And a lot of the hits nowadays are sampling something older, or at the very least, they're very much trying to mimic a sound from the 80s or the 90s or the early 2000s. Like when Olivia Rodrigo first started popping up, it was very much giving Paramore. And even new genres feel less like they're actually new categories and they just feel more like combinations of existing ones, which makes sense. Culture doesn't exist in a vacuum and we've always built on what has come before us. That's just how it works. I think sometimes I'm just craving a bigger leap, like going from a gas stove to an electric one instead of Paramore 1 to Paramore 2. I think you could see this really clearly in the way we name genres now. Everything is just hyphenated, the hyphenation of culture, if you will. So you have bedroom pop or alt indie folk or synth wave. These labels are basically just telling you exactly what's being mixed together. None of these sounds are bad, of course, but still doesn't make them feel fundamentally new to me. They're just carefully blended combinations of things that's already existed. Instead of creating entirely new lanes, we're just refining and remixing all of the old ones that we already had. And a really good example of this is Doechi's song Anxiety. It was pretty much the biggest song to kick off the year, and perhaps part of the reason was because it was sampling Gaudier's Somebody That I Used to Know. And if I butchered his name, I'm so sorry, but that song was already a proven hit, so it has its own feeling and nostalgia that people will attach to it. It's just bringing you back to a specific time in a specific place, and if you like the song, even better. So then boom, Anxiety comes out, or technically re-releases since it first released in 2019, and it ends up being the hit of the start of the year. And I'm sure a lot of the reason was because it was really well made, but I think using that sample also helped a lot. And that's probably why artists use that tactic in the first place, because I mean, if it was already a successful song, why not just do it again? And that's kind of the pattern that we're seeing now. A lot of the songs and new artists that break through aren't necessarily introducing a brand new sound. They're activating a lot of the old ones. It obviously works, and I do love a good sampled song, but it also just reinforces this feeling that we're not really moving forward so much as we're in this loop. But movies and TV are probably the most rinse and repeat part of culture right now. This year especially, the movie and TV industry has felt more and more dominated by sequels and prequels and live action reboots and oh so many adaptations. Everything feels like it's IP, and everything's chosen because it's familiar or already has an audience, not necessarily because it's the best idea, but because it's probably the safest one, the one that's going to make them the most money. Studios don't seem super willing to take risks on these original stories when original stories could potentially fail. They don't have an audience yet. And failures can be expensive, especially when budgets are in the hundreds of millions and marketing can cost almost as much as the movie does itself. Recently, DreamWorks announced a new Shrek movie after all of these years. And if you're a millennial or early Gen Z, I'm sure you probably are as fond of it as I am. Me and my sisters to this day still recite lines from Shrek 1. But when the trailer dropped, people were immediately noticing that the animation style looked a little bit differently and they were clowning it.
What type of bullshit is this? So they released a teaser for the new Shrek 5 movie, and Shrek and Donkey have been redesigned. Listen, Shrek is one of my all-time favorite animated DreamWorks films ever, but I cannot co-sign for this shit right here. Donkey doesn't look as bad. It's still not better than the original. They still need to change that shit back, but he doesn't look as bad. It's Shrek that I have the main problem with. Like, look at his face. It looks like he lost all of his testosterone. Just look at these two side by side and please answer my question. Why did they decide to redesign this shit? Who asked for this? Who was complaining about the design in the first place? Why would you change it? And then to make matters worse, they're releasing the movie in Christmas of 2026. Why do we have to always wait 5 decades for a movie to come out? You don't even know if the earth will still be intact by the time that comes. All I know is, get this shit together ASAP.
They made Shrek look a little bit weird, and if you're gonna mine the Shrek IP, at least bring him back the way that we remembered. I guess they didn't learn from what happened with the Sonic reboot. If you've seen that, then you know how horrible they tried to animate Sonic, and they had to completely redo that animation. Anyways, Shrek is coming back because nostalgia works, and because people have fond memories of these movies and these characters, and they're gonna show up just to feel that fond feeling and take their kids to watch the movie with them. And that's even if the new version doesn't fully earn it. So I definitely get the idea and why they do it, but DreamWorks has genuinely made good movies like How to Train Your Dragon. That is one of my favorite movies, and it's a fairly new IP. It came out when I was in high school, but even that movie has gotten a live action remake this year, and it's not even as old as a movie like The Little Mermaid, because that movie at least released in the late 80s. I get them making a live action reboot for that. But for How to Train Your Dragon, they didn't make that live action because the animated version needed improving or because there was more story to tell. I'm assuming that they did it because live action remakes are now a proven formula at this point, and it's easier to sell something that people already know that they like than to convince them to take a chance on something that's new. And what makes this especially frustrating for me is that I know studios can still produce original ideas because we got The Wild Robot. That proved it for me. I thought that was a fresh idea, and it showed me that talent and creativity is still there somewhere, but it feels like that movie was the exception, not necessarily the rule. It was an original project that was squeezed in between all of those sequels and remakes, and it was a risk that ended up paying off, but one that's harder to justify when safer bets almost always make money. And that's really the core issue for me. They aren't using nostalgia as a form of inspiration, they're using nostalgia as risk management. Studios aren't looking backwards because they're creatively stuck. They are just kind of looking backwards because it's safer for them, it's cheaper for them, and it's very predictable. But safe bets make for boring culture, and when everything's designed to just trigger familiarity instead of curiosity or inspiration, it starts to feel like we're cycling through the same ideas over and over, not because they're the best ideas we've ever had, but because they're the least risky ones. And I mean, that's great for people who haven't seen these original movies, but what about the rest of us? What about the rest of us that's seen all these movies before? Since the dawn of the internet as we know it, the way culture moves and spreads has changed for good. And I covered this idea earlier in the year in my How Trend Cycles Cannibalize Culture video, but subcultures don't really get the time to exist for that long anymore. At least not the way that I feel like they probably used to. Subcultures used to get some time to actually breathe and develop. A scene might have started in a specific city or a specific venue or with specific people, and it could naturally develop away from the mainstream attention. That way, there's some room to figure out what it actually even was, whether that be its language or aesthetics or the values attached to it. And that's all before anyone outside the subculture even knew that it existed. But now I feel like the second that something starts to get interesting, it gets turned into a trend. People post about it online and it gets turned into social media content. And once something's visible or once something's really been identified, it's basically already over. The people who were there early probably feel like it's been co-opted, and the mainstream usually adopts a watered down version of the original thing. And within months or sometimes even weeks, the trend has completely burned out. Visibility ends up killing longevity, at least when it comes to these subcultures. And when When everything is documented and then posted onto social media, nothing really has the space to grow. Thrifting's a really good example of this, not because thrifting itself is creator culture, but because creator culture wrapped itself around it and has changed how it actually ends up functioning. Thrifting used to be about things like necessity, luck, or your personal taste, and people shopped at thrift stores because they needed affordable clothes or because they just genuinely liked digging and finding things no one else has had. Well, I guess not no one else has had, but no one else is wearing. There wasn't really any guidebook and there wasn't an algorithm to tell you what was or wasn't valuable. You had to just look for yourself. But then thrifting became content and a business. So if you are on sites like Depop, you know how overpriced these things can get. We see outfit hauls, resale tips on what to look for, how to flip vintage for profit. And once that knowledge went viral, it completely changed the whole thrifting ecosystem. So thrift stores unfortunately caught on, and I see videos where people are showing the uncharacteristically high prices for a thrift store.
How much?
I let it go for about $40.
$40.
Now resellers are scooping everything up super early, and people that actually rely on thrifting for financial reasons are competing with people that are treating it like a side hustle or an aesthetic. And this is where the algorithm makes things so much more worse, because the algorithm decides what gets seen, what gets recommended, and what ends up getting pushed onto your top feed. And it seems like the people that play it safe end up getting pushed out the most, which leads to other creators doing the same thing and adapting. So they'll use trending sounds, familiar formats, and proven formulas, not because they're necessarily lazy, but because that's how you survive online, especially if this is someone's job and they see that that's the only way they're going to get pushed out into the algorithm. It completely makes sense why they end up adapting. And the more everyone adapts in this similar way, the more everything starts to feel and look the same. And now everyone's optimizing for the same metrics: watch time, engagement, shares, saves. And part of optimizing for those metrics can look like conformity and sameness. And there's barely any room for art that actually takes time to understand or ends up making people feel a little uncomfortable, because if the algorithm doesn't push it, then no one's going to see it. And if no one sees it, it becomes harder and harder to justify making that content at all. And don't even get me started on the AI tools, because they're making all of this even more worse. There's so much AI art, videos, pieces, you name it, and it's getting harder and harder to tell what's real and what's fake. People can use AI to make content that looks and sounds exactly like the real deal, and it makes you stop. I admit to stopping. And the amount of times I've been sent this AI generated content and had to double check and look through the comments to find out if it was real is very crazy. So the barrier to entry to making content is getting lower and lower. It's on the ground at this point. However, the barrier to create something that's actually genuinely new or something that adds to culture instead of just recycling it has never felt higher. And that's probably how we ended up here. Not because people have stopped being creative, but because the systems that we're all operating inside of reward sameness over risk. So for this section, I want to be a little bit more specific, because I'm not saying that no one wants to flop anymore. You actually can try things and end up flopping, especially when you're a small unknown creator, because there's less visibility. The problems really start when you're visible. So artists, musicians, filmmakers, content creators, once you reach a certain level of recognition, the cost of failure starts to change. On the other hand, when you're not famous yet, a flop can just kind of disappear and no one will really remember it. You can try something, and if it doesn't work, you could just move on. There isn't this permanent public record attached to your name. But now everything is documented, public, and searchable thanks to the internet. And once someone's famous and visible, their failure doesn't really just disappear. It follows them. And sometimes you even see it getting brought back up every time that their name starts to trend. I'm sure you can think of a few people. But Ice Spice is a really good example of this, because if you look at the way people talk about her career online, every perceived failure that she has, keyword being perceived, it gets treated as though it's evidence that she doesn't deserve the platform that she was given in the first place. One song underperforms or one feature doesn't necessarily hit, and suddenly her narrative becomes that she was overrated all along. And that kind of stuff is probably really hurtful. I mean, what happened to letting people experiment with their creativity? Why are we so strict here? Everything doesn't have to be a permanent mark against you, but it sure does feel that way on this internet. And that's probably where the fear even comes from. So people who do have that visibility end up playing it very safe. They stick to what's already proven to be successful for them, probably not because they lack ideas, but because there's usually other forces that are involved, like executives, boards, expectations, money. They're all pushing them towards the least risky option. But the cost of that fear is that culture gets safer. And when culture gets safer, it also gets flatter. So to keep culture fresh, we need to actually try things that might not work and be okay with people not understanding it. And probably even more important, that the people with that visibility keep trying new things. I feel like the most interesting art comes from people who aren't afraid of the cringe of failure. There's this saying that's been going around that cringe is the cost of entry. So you have to be willing to look awkward or be wrong or try hard before you can actually make something that's genuinely new. And you have to be willing to fail publicly in pursuit of something better for yourself. And we've built a system where that kind of failure feels hard, especially if you are more visible. And when the people with the biggest platforms stop taking risks, culture stops being something that we're actually actively trying to build towards, and it becomes something that's overly curated. Money, like with most things, is at the center of this problem because that's kind of how culture even gets funded. There used to be more room for art to exist outside of it being purely for profit. Not that artists weren't trying to make money, because I'm sure they always were trying to make money, but there were more spaces where things didn't need to be immediately successful for them to be considered worthwhile. So things like college radio, independent bookstores, those smaller venues, local scenes, publicly funded arts and media that wasn't entirely driven by these engagement metrics. And a lot of that infrastructure is gone now. Everything has to be monetized in some sort of way, and everything has to end up scaling. Everything has to justify itself through ads or subscriptions, brand deals, or numbers on a dashboard, unfortunately. And I get that because people need to eat, but once everything has to make money, it can lead to things starting to flatten, because what makes money is what's already proven to have made money. So studios lean on sequels because sequels are safer bets for them. Musicians are encouraged to make songs that sound like other successful songs because that's what the label feels more comfortable in investing into. So when writers pitch books, they'll say something like it's Harry Potter meets Hunger Games, or the recent wave of romantasy is being sold as A Court of Thorn and Roses meets Game of Thrones, because publishers actually need proof that there's already a market, and it's shorthand that tells investors that it's already a safe bet. And even independent creators have to think like businesses now, so you can't just make something and hope that the right people are going to end up finding it. You have to build your brand and grow an audience and optimize for platforms and think about monetization from day one. So you end up being your own marketer, strategist, and an analyst while you're also trying to be an artist. So it can be very tiring, and that pressure naturally changes what you actually end up making. In comes the calculated ideas that are designed to hit the specific metrics, and out goes the concepts of exploring newer ideas or taking risks or doing something that might not appeal to everybody. And the gag is that is the most interesting type of art. It comes from people who have that freedom to make things that might flop at first. People who can afford to be weird or specific or uncommercial. I think that kind of freedom is getting harder to come by, and when it completely disappears, culture flattens right along with it. But here's another possibility. Maybe the problem isn't that culture actually stopped innovating. Maybe we're just too exhausted to recognize when innovation's happening, or we're ruining the conditions that we need to let those new things develop in the first place. We're honestly just so overstimulated and oversaturated with things to pay attention to. We just scroll past thousands of images a day. We hear dozens of songs. We watch hours and hours of video, and none of it really has the time to sink in because we're immediately on to the next thing. Innovation needs attention. It needs our time. And a lot of the art we still think about to this day wasn't immediately thought of as something that was groundbreaking. It took us a little bit of time. We had to learn its language to really understand what made it different. For example, with the movie Matrix, a movie I'm sure we've seen or have seen being referenced. When it first came out, a lot of people didn't really understand how iconic it was going to grow to be besides the surface level action. I mean, Will Smith read the script and passed on it. It took time for the theories and ideas about reality, control, and technology to really start to sink in, but now it's considered one of the most influential films of its era, and that kind of delayed understanding feels almost impossible in today's current cultural climate. Now we kind of decide almost instantly. If something doesn't register as new or exciting or familiar in that particular type of way, we end up moving on, and we assume that we've seen it before. So maybe new things are happening and we're just too burned out to actually notice, and that's just a theory. Maybe there are subcultures that are forming in the corners of the internet that we're not paying attention to, and maybe artists are taking risks, but they're doing it in ways we don't recognize because we're looking for innovation to look the same way that it always has. Maybe we've gotten so good at pattern recognition that anything outside of that pattern goes unnoticed. Or maybe we just can't be surprised anymore. And it's not just about our attention, it's also about the time that we're giving things. Because real innovation takes a few tries. You have to iterate a few times before you're successful. And we don't really allow for that process anymore. At least that's what it feels like, because everything's expected to be fully formed right away. It's kind of like when an artist's first song goes viral and then people immediately start asking if they're a one-hit wonder. People can be very quick to judge, so everything has to prove its worth very fast, or it ends up getting tossed aside. It's almost like there's no room for growth, and without that room, how's anything that's actually new supposed to emerge? And that could be the real problem. Not that we've necessarily run out of ideas, but that we optimize culture for speed and visibility and short-term success at the expense of patience and long-term growth. Maybe culture didn't exactly peak, and maybe we peaked. Oop.
And oop.
Our attention, our patience, our willingness to let things be awkward while they figure out what they're going to become. So what's the answer to did culture peak? I actually don't know. I think it's to be determined. On some days it feels like yes, everything feels like it's recycled or a derivative of something else, or like we're rearranging the same pieces and pretending like it's something new. Or it could feel like the best days are behind us and now we're stuck in this endless loop of revivals and reboots and nostalgia packaged as innovation. And on other days I'll watch a really weird movie or a fresh TV show and I'll feel like, hey, no, culture is still new, it's still innovating, it's still fresh. Culture is always built on what came before it, and every generation thinks that the previous one did it better. Things that feel genuinely new do actually break through every once in a while, and some days it feels like the question itself is probably wrong. Like, maybe culture didn't peak necessarily. Maybe it's just changing into something that we don't fully recognize yet. We could be so focused on the kind of innovation that we're used to that we're missing the ones that are less identifiable to us. But what I am pretty sure of is that we've created conditions that make real innovation a lot harder than it used to be. Constant visibility, algorithmic optimization, economic pressure, the fear of public failure. There's no room to be bad in public, and there's no space for ideas to actually develop. And that doesn't mean new things can't happen. They just need a lot more protection and patience from us. So hopefully people can support art that doesn't immediately make sense to them, or maybe it even feels at first. So maybe culture didn't peak and we just forgot how to let it grow, or maybe it did peak and we're in a long decline and there's nothing to be done about it. Who knows? Maybe this is just what happens when everything's been done already. But the question is still worth asking, because if we really are stuck remixing the past, then at some point we have to ask why, and we have to think about whether we're okay with that or whether we're just going to keep pretending that recycling the past counts as building the future. So that's all I have for you guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. What do you guys think? Did culture peak? Are we cooked? Is it over? If you ended up watching to the end, please comment the mountain emoji. I hope you guys all have a really good holiday. I hope to see all the familiar commenters in the next year as well. Thank you so much. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you guys next year.